So welcome to At the Table with the Asian American Christian Collaborative. At the Table is a series of roundtable discussions where Asian American Christian pastors and leaders draw from their experience, their expertise, their education to discuss matters of import to the Asian American Christian community and church and the broader church at large. I'm so thrilled to be here to talk about flourishing in terms of mental health with three distinguished friends and colleagues. I'll have each of you introduce yourselves as we go in. My name is Chang. I serve as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, and I'm so glad we're here together.
Okay. And I'm Curtis Lowe, and I have been a pastor for 37 years. Just recently retired, so very excited about that. But I had the privilege of serving 4 different churches in my years of ministry. 2 were more Chinese, very Chinese churches, and 2 were Asian American churches.
Not retiring, repositioning.
Repositioning, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So.
My name is David Kim. I'm the pastor of the Garden Church in Chatsworth, not far from here. We founded the church 29 years ago and still ticking. So it's an Asian American church, and it's a blessing to be here.
I'm Jason Min. I pastor a church in downtown Los Angeles called Citizens LA. I've been in this role for almost 5 years now. And so, it's good to be here.
It's great to be with all of you. As we dive in, I'm just curious, how would you define or describe what flourishing is? How do you understand flourishing?
Flourishing, I think, deals, obviously, we're thinking of something growing. But when something grows, I think it is something that it needs an atmosphere. It needs something that improves its health. And so I think of flourishing as being something that's healthy, with good root system, good stalk, good fruit. But also, I think flourishing happens, when manure happens, right? Because things that grow also need things that are decomposing. So I think that when we do experiencing flourishing, it also can happen during tough times. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Would you say, are you talking about flourishing in mental, specifically?
Flourishing as general.
Oh yeah, well that's pertinent in terms of our church name, the Garden, and something that is healthy, like you said, good root system, bearing fruit in season, and there's just different seasons also. So it's not always like kind of bearing a lot of fruit all the time, but I think, just as there's different winter, fall, spring, and summer, I think being able to be healthy in the different seasons of life. Yeah, I think that's what I would.
Great.
I guess for me, in the context, especially of faith, I would say flourishing. I think about the restoration of our full humanity, in and through Christ. I think about wholeness, freedom, meaning, community, and kind of off of what you said, I think a lot of times we think flourishing is the absence of pain or sadness, but I see it a little bit more as all of these things in the midst of pain and sadness. How can we be whole and healthy in the midst of the brokenness around us?
That's good. So all 3 of your pastors, Chinese American, Korean American. I'm Korean American. Different generations. I would say you're on our more seasoned end.
Thank you. That's very nice to put.
You might be at the peak of ministry, and Jason and I think we're the same age. So we're not the youngest. We're not quite spring chickens, but we still have a few miles left on our tread, maybe. One of the things I hear all over the country, and this is not even simply pertaining to the Asian American church, but just every demographic, is that there is a mental health crisis. All of your pastors, what are you seeing?
Well, maybe the oldest doesn't always have to speak first. So
Asian culture.
Asian culture. Yeah. But I think I especially see it in our youth, and I think that's what has been so compelling to me, to want to try to be relevant to that age group, and as a not as a peer, obviously, to them, but as, and many of them, like our youth, more like as a grandfather to them. And I think when I would thinking of our Asian culture, you think of your grandparents. You are taught to honor them. You're taught to respect them, and I think that still permeates our culture. And I think that youth really respect just talking to them, just listening. And COVID brought out in our youth at our church just conversations like, I'm depressed, I feel stuck, I'm locked, I'm in jail, I don't get to be with my friends. The best part of my life is being taken away from me. And just before we retired, a young lady in college came up to me, and I had shared my story during a Sunday school class about my mental health problems in college. And so she wanted to come and share her story about her mental health problems. And I think that just being honest at any age brings that out. But I think that then affects the family. So really, it's everybody. And so we've had parents come to us and tell us, my kid's really depressed. I think my kid might be suicidal. So it's everywhere. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that no family is spared from some kind of mental health challenge.
Yeah, I would agree just in terms of particularly regarding the youth and the pandemic just was like a tornado, I think. What I think makes it particular, in the Asian American context, what makes it even harder issue is because it's a shame-based culture. So I think mental health, the topic of mental health has been, it's been in the shadows. And thankfully, I think that's changing. But I think compared to just kind of the general population, I think Asian Americans, they don't want to share about these kind of things. And I think it's still there. It's getting better with younger people. But, and personally, for me, I felt led to share my journey, about mental health and my struggles with clinical depression. That's been a part of my journey for all my adult life. And I felt shame around it, being a pastor and, why don't you just pray and it'll go away? And, I prayed and it didn't go away. I take medication, for my, and see a counselor. It's definitely manageable. And I felt in this time, the Lord clearly tell me to share about that journey. And I think it was helpful, in that people, if their pastor is going through this stuff, then it gave them just an openness to share. And so, but still, I struggled with that shame. I mean, I've gotten a lot of healing from that, which enabled me to share. But I think that makes it, that much harder within the Asian community. Because if people aren't able to talk about it, they can't get help. And it has some dire consequences. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's huge. I mean, we put out kind of a counseling interest form to get a little bit of a pulse about where people were at in terms of wanting help or resources, and we couldn't manage the number of counseling interest forms that were coming in. I think COVID, played a huge part in that, but I think technology and social media in general has created such an epidemic of comparison, anxiety. Growing up for me, like words like anxiety, panic attacks, depression, that was not common language. They were like one-off situations. Now you'd be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't struggle with anxiety or depression of some sort, who hasn't been through a season of that. And so, for sure, and I think there's kind of, especially in Los Angeles where I pastor, there is a kind of muscle confusion that happens because on one hand, you're in a big city, you're very connected, technology helps you feel very connected, and yet you feel on the other side of that so lonely and so without community. And so I think sometimes that gap and that disconnect just aggravates the problem, makes it worse.
Yeah, it's like a connected isolation
Yes.
that people are feeling, and it's the isolation that bonds us together more
Right.
than anything. Yeah, I mean, y'all are pastors, right? So you're on the front lines, and I don't think a lot of people know the burden that people carry. And there's a couple of things that, especially the two of you shared, that I think I want to kind of follow up on. On the one hand, as pastors, we're called to care for the flock, the whole being of the flock. What's challenging is mental health is complex, and it requires a lot of energy and time and effort and resources that, quite frankly, not any individual can necessarily solve. I mean, like, when I see a therapist, I see them once every week. That's 1 full hour that I'm seeing a person. If your church is 7 people, that might be feasible.
Yeah.
But let's say your church is 700 people, 70 people, 500. It just becomes impossible. Then, especially after the Laguna Woods shooting, one of the things that we noticed, especially with the Taiwanese Christian community, most people might not know this, but about half of the Taiwanese American population lives in California. And somewhere between 30 and 40% of the Taiwanese population is probably Christian. We're not fully sure, but it seems like somewhere around there. So that means there's probably about 200,000, 300,000 Taiwanese Christians in the California area. We surveyed all of California to see how many Taiwanese therapists there were, Taiwanese Christian therapists. I think we found 5.
Yeah.
And especially after such acute trauma that was specifically targeting them in such unique dynamics, and the kind of growing body of research that suggests that race competent and culturally competent therapy actually makes a difference, leads us to wonder, what do we do when we have 5 therapists for a population of 200,000? And how are you navigating it as a church?
We were doing mental health ministry in our church, and it's a small Chinese church, but we did it for the community. And we put together resources. And so it was very easy if somebody from a community-based neighborhood, Caucasian, multi-ethnic church would call, and we could find resource for them. But we would get calls from people who say, my mom is having a real hard time. She speaks Cantonese. Right? Is there somebody or Mandarin or Taiwanese? And we don't. And so the best that we could do was to try to find people who would be willing to go with them, who could translate. But that still doesn't solve the need of the more intimate and personal and professional needs of a person to be able to have interaction with somebody who can speak their language, understand their culture from that way. But we just have to, I think as a church body, provide that relationship that can at least encourage the caregivers. We can't always minister right now to the people who are going through the crisis. We can do our best. I mean, I'm surprised you even found 5. So
We scoured.
Yeah.
And there might be more, but it's really hard to find them.
Yeah, it is really hard. But you just keep increasing your contacts. So you ask those 5, do you know Mandarin speaking? And you keep a list, and you just keep asking. And you go to the schools and you can call, since Rosemead and Fuller are around here, and School of Psychology at Azusa Pacific School of Psychology, and just ask them, do they know of these language speaking therapists?
Yeah, for us, so we partnered with DJ Chang, who is part of AACC. I think, I'm not sure if that's still going to that partnership, but he was very helpful to come up with a strategy. You're right. I mean, the lines to, the waiting time to find a therapist was just really, crazy over the pandemic. So that's a big part, but I think there's other things that the whole community can do. Talking about it, from the pulpit, we have testimonies, and then equipping seminars. And we really encouraged our lay leaders to, explore and, pursue a greater degree of mental health, and then also just some tips of how to create safe spaces for those conversations. And I think that goes a long way, having community, small groups where people can really be honest and share. It's not, professional counseling, but that really helps a culture of health. So it really takes, I think, it takes a real coordinated, you have to partner with outside, counselors and, other resources that are out there. And then within the church, try to utilize, lay leadership and just creating safe spaces for people to be able to share. But it's pretty huge. Yeah, it's a 10-headed monster for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think like what we realize is you really do need a kind of multi-dimensional approach to it. I think it's easy to kind of say, okay, you have a mental health issue, here are a list of therapists. And I think there are definitely occasions and times when people need professional therapy and specialized therapy. But from my experience, pastoring our community, you just have such a range and a spectrum of what people need and are even looking for. And so how are you cultivating safe spaces like within your small group system? How are you training and equipping your leaders who facilitate those small groups to be safe spaces for people? Because sometimes all people need is just a place to share kind of what they're going through and people to walk alongside them. Sometimes they need a little bit more specialized care. But even creating a robust enough system for all your leaders to be able to help identify those things like, I think what this person really needs is a friend, or what this person needs is maybe someone more specialized in trauma or grief and things like that. And one of the things for us we realized was, I don't know if it's an Asian American specific issue, but maybe it's connected to the shame aspect of it. A lot of people don't even know the first step to seek out the help that they need. So it's like, how do you even look for a therapist? They don't even know that, there are things about maybe having an Asian American therapist that could make the process a lot easier. Like they don't even have that, I don't even think they have that training or knowledge. And so I think with the church, like you really you can't, like a list of vetted therapists is not enough. I feel like you need kind of, it's an all hands on deck type of issue. Yeah.
So how do you discern that, right? I mean, because it can't just fall on you, but in some ways the church takes the lead from what pastors do and what pastors say, okay, this is when we should refer out. This is when, we should try to encourage the community. And for many people who are seeking therapy, they are simply looking for connection and a safe space or someone that's willing to lend them an ear so that it allows them to really, and then there's other people that just don't have language. So they need to find therapy, but they don't know how to. So like, I think about my uncle, grew up, through the Korean War, became a doctor. But I remember him telling me about how he was, in order to put himself through med school, he was basically studying as he was putting coals in a boiler and, reading books through a flickering light throughout the middle of the night and then going to classes the next day. So it was just like this excruciating. I was like, that must have been stressful. He said, that's interesting that you say that because I didn't have language for stress when I was growing up. I don't know what stress is. And that was such an illuminating moment for me because I'm like, he couldn't name it, so he didn't know what kind of help he might have needed. Now, I'm sure that led to all sorts of challenges. I love him, and he's great, and he's been nothing but wonderful. But I do wonder, like, what was the impact of that on him? And so how do you navigate that as pastor? How do you guide your church to find, when do you say, this is the point for you to find professional help? Here's what our community can do, and here's what we can't do.
I think the role of the pulpit is really, really important to be able to just share and, because if people don't have the categories, then they don't even know what the struggles are. So not just personal struggles, but just creating those kind of languages, that kind of language about mental health, not all the time, but I think that helps. And then we started having some testimonies specifically. So when people share about their journey of how they sought counseling and what their specific struggle was, like DJ shared his testimony at our church, and that just gives a grid, for people to see themselves in that way. I think that's been really helpful. Another thing that kind of came organically was there's counselors in the church, therapists in the church, so they're part of a team, and they're kind of like the referral team. So like if people have any questions, they can just contact them and they will be able to assess, like do they need further. So then I'm grateful for that because it doesn't fall on me. It's called Deeper Water, so that we have an email group, and if they have any questions, and they're, because they have a better sense because they're professionals. So those are some of the things. But I think the power of testimony and the pulpit, to give that kind of grid, biblical grid, but also including mental health. And I think in the past, I didn't really talk about that because it wasn't really as much part of my grid either.
Yeah.
But it's all over the Bible, look at the Psalms and, depression.
Now, so before you answer, some people might say, well, the pulpit is reserved for the preaching of God's word. What does this have to do with the word of God?
Well, if you preach Psalms, then you're going to be talking about, and other things too, but particularly Psalms and, Bible talks about renewing your mind and, being whole, your spirit, body, soul, Thessalonians. So it's all there, I think, just you have to, you don't even have to look far, to have that kind of, to talk about these things that are in the Bible.
And I mean, related to that pulpit ministry, I don't know that, I think I'm seeing a lot more of it now, but I don't know that especially Asian Americans have a robust enough theology around grief or suffering, pain. And I think you need, in some ways from the pulpit, people need to hear that regularly, so that they can feel seen in whatever they're going through, so that they get language, to be able to talk about some of these things. And I completely agree. Like, I think more than ever, I feel like pastors and churches need to empower and enlist their members, people in their own congregations who are doing a lot of this work. And I know not all pastors have that luxury, but for us as well, tapping marriage family therapists in our congregation, psychiatrists, psychologists, family counselors, any resources that we have. And we recently did a mental health panel in our community where I was learning so much in real time. Small things like having a therapist talk to us around, what are the warning signs of like extremely serious suicidal ideation? Like what are some key words and phrases to look out for? That kind of practical information, like a pastor doesn't always have that readily available, but how do you empower the people in your church that are doing this? And I feel like it's actually an amazing way to also help people to see that ministry isn't just what happens on Sunday or what happens from a pulpit, but that there's definitely this sense of, we're co-creating something together, we're collaborating to pastor this church and this city together, and I think that's really powerful.
I really appreciate what Dave and Jason said, because it encompasses sort of an organic approach that you share your story. And I think stories are segues. And I think sermons can be segues to other forms of help. So you might have a Sunday school class that would deal with that. You could have a class on lamenting. There are more and more resources on that. And you talked about what I was just going to share too. I think, we want to take advantage of any resource we have in the church, but there are many resources outside the church.
Yes.
And we should take advantage of them. And not everybody is going to necessarily flock and want to learn how to be a caregiver, to somebody who's going through a mental struggle, but there will be enough, right, in any church, I think, who will be really interested in that. And then your church is sort of like doing what it can, right? You just sort of present the opportunity, but you do have to plan for it. And you can help people to become helpers of people. And I think, that's when it really becomes so meaningful. When you hear a story about how, somebody in the church heard about someone's mom who was really struggling and was in the hospital, and they went to go visit them, went to go pray with them, and just gave them comfort and continued to follow up. I think that, we do have enough resource to keep expanding our knowledge and our experience.
That's good. Now, earlier I brought up kind of how pastors are kind of responsible for the whole person and the whole flock. But that's also a huge responsibility and burden, right? It's almost too much for any person to carry. And in addition, many pastors struggle with our own mental health challenges that we also often can't be vulnerable. I mean, it takes time, and we have to constantly calculate: is this safe? What would happen if I share this, and what would happen if I share that? I don't know if a lot of people understand like the weight that pastors carry, especially around this issue. Do you want to kind of pull the curtain back and share a little bit about what that's like, and what would you like the average congregant to know in any given church, what pastors carry, especially around this topic?
So our story goes back to when I was a 20-year-old, and
Like 5 years ago?
yeah, and I started having depression, and it grew into full-blown clinical depression, and it included OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and it led to a suicide attempt, and I carried that with me for many years, and as I found healing, as I found help, and went into ministry, it was not something that I would share. And it's just something that, it just felt too personal. And, but then after I got married, my wife started having symptoms and ended up having a serious episode of bipolar, and was diagnosed with bipolar. And I needed to take a break from the ministry. And the elders of my church said, Curtis, you take care of your wife, we'll take care of the church. But one of the members of the church was a nurse who worked as a psychiatric nurse. And she came to me and she said two things. She said, Curtis, we want to protect your wife's privacy, but we also want to inform the church how they can help. And I encourage you to share with the church what just happened. So it took a lot of courage. It was an Asian American church, but we shared it. And previous to that, my wife had another episode at a Chinese church, maybe about 7 years earlier, and we never shared it. Only a few people knew. So we went completely through 9 years of ministry without sharing it with the church. And we hid it because it just felt so shameful. It felt very taboo, and we were afraid of what people would say. But in that experience of sharing it when Carol was first diagnosed and hospitalized, we got so much love and so much support and so much understanding. And after 3 months of letting me take a leave of absence, gradually I came back in the church, and Carol herself got involved in the church. Once she got her care, when she got her therapy, it was unnoticeable. And it was just something I think is so important, is that when you do open up, but you do it carefully, that I think that people will know that the pastor has his own problems, and that we're not immune to the diseases of this world. We're not immune to the stresses of this world. And then you do have opportunity, because, I wouldn't say ministry caused our disease. We carried it with our DNA, but it certainly triggered it. And I think that people understood, and we had to incorporate times of rest into our schedule so that people would know. And then we shared those times of rest with people, that they could walk with us through them. and what that was like to have a quiet day together. And we provided like a seminar, a day, quiet day for them to experience, spiritual rest, not just, emotional or mental rest, but we are whole beings. And so I think we were gradually able to expand our sharing about how being vulnerable was important. And, I love the fact that Dave's been with us for 29 years, and we were just talking about that before here, and that builds a lot of trust. It builds a lot of trust. So it does take time. I think it does take time with people to know when it's safe. But eventually, I think where we are, we should share. And maybe as pastors, we should also only share when we feel we have that safety net behind us to care for us, because we don't know what's going to come after us after we share. But we probably need to be somewhat careful about how vulnerable we are at first. And that's not an issue of being ashamed of ourselves, but I think maybe being wise about the process.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have my own counselor. I need it, for my own mental well-being, and that's been super helpful. I agree. I think vulnerability, especially from the pulpit, is huge. And I would say, I know that sometimes there is a way where pastors can use the pulpit as their therapy,
Yeah.
and they can leak out from the pulpit. So I know that I think there's a lot of wisdom with that. But I also think that there is something powerful also, not just sharing the story of healing, but also sharing with the congregation even in the process, as you're walking through some of these things. I remember in 2020, it's the same thing, very nervous about sharing, that things were difficult, at home. I was navigating my own stuff, and I think you're used to hearing pastors say, this is what I went through, God healed me, and now I'm great. And I don't know that there are enough pastors who are saying, this is what I'm going through right now, and I'm still working through this, and I need to depend on the power of Christ every day to get through this. And I do think there is something different about that as well, especially for an Asian American congregation that oftentimes approaches mental health as something that needs to be fixed, or like something that needs to be solved, versus like a journey that you're on, that you need to regularly depend on the power of the Holy Spirit, your community around you. And so I think that should be modeled more by pastors.
Yeah, some good points. Really appreciate your sharing your journeys. And I think for me, and what I see when the church, in the beginning years of the ministry, I felt so much shame around, depression. I was going through that. And actually ministry was a contributing factor to depression because of all the pressure that I felt. And I think in the Asian community too, Asian American community, there's so much expectation, and pastors are kind of put up in this kind of, pedestal, like you shouldn't have any problems. And pastors kind of buy into that. I bought into that, so I can't share weakness. And so then when you feel that pressure, it's going to push you down more. And I kept it all to myself, and which makes it even worse. I think, ministry is incredibly difficult on mental health. And, I'm thankful that finally I was able to get help and then be able to become that kind of wounded healer where you share your journey. Henry Nouwen's book, share your journey, and we really can't take it all on ourselves. Like this, when I was thinking about how we started opening up to this area of ministry and mental health, and I was kind of overwhelmed. I was like, how can I do this? And felt it, and then realized, it's a team, call upon resources inside the church and outside the church. I think kind of the old model is, the pastor can do it, and then that's going to just actually create really, really a lot of stress and poor mental health. And I've experienced that, where we try to take it upon ourselves. And some of it is real, but some of it we add to ourselves. So, if ministry leaders can find healing, and also put limitations to what they can and can't do, that's going to help the situation, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for, sharing. I think even, for those who are going to listen in, they'll find this healing, because I'm not sure if I've been around a table with other Asian American pastors. Everyone's talking about counseling and receiving counseling, or experiencing depression and suicidal ideation, and we all know that it's out there, but we don't know who's navigating it, because we all have to kind of put on this facade. And so as we wrap up this conversation, I wonder if there's one practical thing, especially pertaining to mental health, that you would like to encourage, whether they're a pastor or congregant or a church overall, to engage with, to start doing, in order to flourish in this next season.
The word that comes to mind is community. I think at each one of those stages, I would encourage people to find and build community. If you're a pastor, find another pastor. Talk to them. Just get to know. If you already know one, just keep that going. I'm sure you're already doing it. If you're, a congregant, see if there's a way, if you don't already have it. Sounds like each of our churches here already have it, but maybe yours doesn't. A community of people who care about mental health and, want to just share and pray. And I think that, tying into the community that's out in our communities, there's the National, Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, and they're so helpful. And they even have a faith-based portion of it called FaithNet. And so, you can find that help for mental health, for yourself, for your church body, or for your outreach. I think community would be an important concept that I would, really more of a real relationships that I would say we really need to build up and strengthen mental health and be the people that we are really made to be, because we were made to share our hurts with one another.
Yeah, I totally agree with that community aspect, and with that concept, creating safe spaces, for people to be able to share. I think that goes such a long way, where people, because everybody is struggling to one degree or another. Some is more extreme, and some need, counseling and medication. Others, but everybody needs a safe space, and so to really be proactive in promoting people to be a safe space for somebody, and to find a safe space. If we can move the ball forward in that, I think the level is going to go up quite a bit. So yeah, it's community.
Yeah, when I think about what the church could be at its best, I would say it would be a therapeutic community for healing, and where people can experience wholeness and community. And maybe my one encouragement for pastors and leaders would be to really examine how the structures and how kind of like some of the implicit practices, explicit and implicit practices you do in your community, how it fosters that kind of a community. I think a lot of times we're building structures, and we're in order to build a more impressive organization sometimes, but what is in place so that people can find safe spaces to process some of this stuff. So, one very practical example would be something like, is there a fund, or are there resources readily available for people looking for, mental health resources? Are there things in place, trainings in place, things that you do with your leaders that fosters that kind of a community? Because I think we can talk about it, but I think really putting that into practice and having it reflect, like if a person looked at your budget and they looked at kind of your structures and the way you do church, given that mental health feels like a more and more universal issue that's impacting people of all ages, how are you as a church doing in terms of creating that kind of a community. And so I do think that kind of self-examination is probably really important.
That's great. I would also say, just kind of dawned on me, I mean, as the church, as Christians in this area, I mean, we have the resources, from God. And I mean, we have, one another, which is, God-given resources, but we have the Holy Spirit, we have the power of the Word of God, and, that's the game changer, and to really lean into that, into this area, I think, of mental health, then you can find the wholeness and healing. I mean, we're all talking about that, but just kind of naming that, that we have, and that's how I found healing is through Christ, and a Christian counselor. And we have that, all of us have that as part of our inheritance in Christ.
That's a good word to end with. Well, thanks so much for joining me at the table and to think about community, which we're so inclined to do as Asian Americans. I feel like we should be way ahead, but then shame oftentimes holds us back. This has been at the table with the Asian American Christian Collaborative. If you found this helpful, we encourage you to share it with others. Check out all the other resources on our website at asianamericanchristiancollaborative.com on these topics and many others. Follow us on social media, aachristcollab.com, and then if you are willing, AACC is a volunteer-driven and donor-led or donor-driven organization, and so you can give to us there, and we are looking forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again.
Thank you for having us.